missile fly down an air vent. Pretty unbelievable. But couldn't we feasibly use that same technology to shoot food at hungry people?
This one is dedicated to the suit-wearing arms dealers, to the champagne-sipping, depleted uranium droppers.
Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone. Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone.
First in my scope is BAE Systems, specialize in killing people from a distance. Power is a drug and they feed the addiction. Immediate deletion of people's existence. Who says what isn't legitimate resistance? To push these buttons, you don't need a brave heart. State-of-the-art darts leave more than your face scarred. You might impress an A&R with your fake bars, cause you probably think Rolls-Royce only make cars. This is for the colonizers, turn bomb providers. Take this beef all the way back to Oppenheimer. They call it warfare, but your wars aren't fair. If they were to be suicide bombers in arms fairs, a scam for the funds. They will mangle your son. If you try to speak out, they will stamp on your tongue. To your land they will come till you stand up as one. It's begun.
Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone. Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone.
Next in my scope is Lockheed Martin. They will tell you when the bombs need blasting. Don't think, just listen to the songs, keep dancing. Do they really want us to have our own brains? Who do you think is really running Guantanamo Bay? And it might be sensitive, but I'll mention it. Who do you think's got us filling out the censuses? Who do you think is handing out the sentences? This ain't the BBC, so there's no censorship. Heard of many mercenaries getting with the clever pimp. Not a gun seller, but none's better than Eric Prince. Make money off many things, mainly it's crime. This one is dedicated to the Raytheon 9. On a scam for the funds, they will mangle your son. If you try to speak out, they will stamp on your tongue. To your land they will come till you stand up as one. It's begun.
Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone. Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone.
Welcome to The Long Way Around. I'm your host, Malcolm Byrne. You're listening to Radio Kingston, WKNY, 1490 AM on your dial, 107.9 FM, and on the internet at radiokingston.org. Tonight I'm joined by a very special guest and dear friend. Mark Moody is a litigator and writer. He's always been a betabilitarian, even when he didn't know the word. Welcome to the show, Mr. Moody.
Thank you so much for having me, Malcolm. It's an absolute honor to be here and to sit across from your smiling face, as it always is, though we've never done it on the radio before.
No. Before we go too far, what in the heck is a betabilitarian?
Betabilitarian is a word invented by one of our, by our, I mean the United States of America's most venerable or venerated Supreme Court justices, named Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he got into he had some very restrictive views on free speech. And he got into a long argument with John Stuart Mill and a very appropriately named Judge Learned Hand, who sat on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals at the time, about free speech, and ultimately changed his mind. And I think that's what led him to coin the term betabilitarian. And what he meant by it, and what I mean by it, is that a betabilitarian is a person who believes that human beings can't know the secrets to the universe. And so the best thing that they can do is gather all information available to them on whatever question they're considering and make a bet as to what it is. But after they've made that bet, they have to be aware that not only is all the information available on that question not necessarily available to them given the tools available to human beings at the time, but also that maybe they missed something or misunderstood something. And so when a betabilitarian realizes that he or she is wrong, they're not ashamed to admit it, rather the opposite. They're rather proud to admit it, because being wrong is a learning process.
Well, I think I'm going to join that club.
I thought you might.
Yeah, for sure. Because, I'm often wrong and proven wrong when I often thought I was right about certain things.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's other things I've been proven right about that many people were proven wrong about, but we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to try hard not to take positions on things unless you've studied or thought about them a considerable amount. There are so many issues. There have always been so many issues for human beings to deal with, and now that number is exponential given the technology that we're dealing with. It's utterly amazing.
Well, I had a conversation earlier this afternoon with someone, work associate and friend, and part of the conversation was about this idea that it's always seemed like we were on the precipice of imminent disaster and chaos. I mean, back, if you go back to the 70s I was fairly young at the time, but when Richard Nixon was president, we thought the world couldn't get much worse. We had Vietnam going on and, Nixon and Watergate and all of this kind of stuff going on. And, what happened in Chile in 1972. I mean, there's a lot of, there's horrible civil war and flooding in Bangladesh. And, it just felt like it couldn't. So, but I'm of the opinion, and perhaps you may wade into this conversation, that we are in a slightly different kind of conversation at this point in human history, partly due to the fact that there is so much information available, and people's opinions can be swayed fairly easily in various different directions. Social media seems to have been largely infiltrated by corporate interests and government interests. So, follow up on that, Mr. Moody.
Well, let me take the word precipice first. I think those precipices from the past have always been somewhat manufactured. I mean, we knew about Allende and Pinochet because the news media at the time chose to let us know about them, and we knew about the floods. I'm not particularly sure which ones you're describing, but whichever ones you're referring to, we knew about them because the news media decided to let us know about them. And now, with this utterly magnificent tool called the internet, we know about every single flood everywhere at any moment and every single disaster everywhere at any moment, and it can keep being rammed down our throats and driving our fear through the roof. And I think that's easily manipulable by those who would like to manipulate. And I think that at the same time, what the internet's doing is showing all those willing to look that there is just an utter infinite magnificence to what the human brain is capable of. And, the acts of kindness and the acts of love and the, pieces of the art and music and all of it that the human brain can produce. Just because we haven't heard the name of the person producing it doesn't mean it's not brilliant. And we can find that if we search for it online. We can't find it if we believe that our searches are appropriately channeled by those that own the what would you call them, the pipelines of information. that allow us to see both, the terrible things that go on and the terrific things that go on. And just to go back to that word precipice, I think that humanity is currently on a precipice. And
on various different levels, of course.
Yeah, and the question is whether humanity finally wins, whether humanity finally educates itself. I think humanity, at least in the West, I don't talk about anywhere else because I don't speak many of the other Western languages either, but they're a little easier for me to grasp, perhaps, than Chinese or Russian, for example. At least in the West, we've been struggling. Humanity, that is, has been struggling against control by a handful of people for 3,000 years at least.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with a book by a writer by the name of Jane Jacobs. Her last book was called Dark Age Ahead, where she starts out the book talking about how in the Middle Ages, all knowledge was kept in this literally like gilded tower by the Catholic Church, and just kind of dispensed as need be to the masses, until, I suppose, till the times of the Enlightenment, when knowledge became a little more, it was a very interesting period in history. But I want to go back before we get, because I want to talk about Thomas Paine at some point in our conversation.
Who's that?
Some guy. But before we talk about Thomas Paine, I'd like to talk about how we first encountered one another, the circumstances of that. We met, I believe it was in sometime in 2015, or must have been between 2015.
It was either late 2015. It was late 2015 or early 2016.
Right. And I was immersed in sort of the Bernie Sanders campaign and had become involved in independent voting, the organization. And through those various connections, we became, associated. And
friends, I like to say.
Friends, yeah. And, well, co-conspirators and friends, of course. But you were involved in an interesting effort at that time to sue. Was it the state of New York or the Democratic Party, or both? Or
no, it was the New York City and state boards of election.
Right. Now, walk me back through those circumstances, how you came to that, and then what the process was and what the results were.
So, I've been I hate the words left and right now because they don't mean anything anymore. But from a traditional perspective, I've been a diehard lefty my entire life, which means I don't like war, and I don't like other people telling other people what to do. That's about the extent of it. And I'd been Democratic. I'm one of the people that Obama thoroughly fooled. I cried. I was sitting in the Electric Ballroom in London when I found out that he'd won, and I cried with pleasure. More fool me. And Bernie came on the scene, and I had never heard anybody speak like that, as was true for hundreds of thousands and millions of other people, not just Americans. And it was inspirational, particularly after those 8 long years of Obama. And I saw hope in Bernie, and I was, I've never been particularly necessarily good at playing in the sandbox with others. So joining political organizations and getting involved with that sort of thing has never really been my thing, but I've, paid attention to the extent that I have, and my attention has grown over the years, in my own way, and I very much wanted to vote for Bernie in the New York primary, and I had totally forgotten that I'd previously been registered Democrat, but at some point had changed to independent. And so about, 60 days or so before the election, I went to change my registration. And I sent it in and all the rest of it.
So, wait, were you were not registered any longer as a Democrat, or you were?
I was registered as an independent.
As an independent, okay.
Yeah.
So you wanted to register as a Democrat in order to vote for Bernie.
Exactly.
In the primaries.
In the primary. And New York has a closed primary, which is a draconian anti-voting provision.
Now I know because I was involved with the open primaries petition to try and change the rules committee at the DNC.
Yeah.
Platform committee and at the convention.
Right.
That's what I was doing.
And on voting day, I went to vote, and they told me I couldn't. So I asked them why I couldn't, and they couldn't really explain, as is often the case with poll workers, not their fault at all. Mm. And so I went down to 100 Varick Street, which is where the City Board of Elections sits.
In New York City.
In New York City, in Manhattan. And I went to find out why I wasn't allowed to vote. And they explained to me that it was because I'd changed my registration to independent. And I said, well, I'd like to change it back to Democrat now then. And they said, well, you can't do that. And I said, why not? They said, well, because the election law in New York doesn't permit that. And I said, well, that sounds like a pretty silly law to me. And
it doesn't just sound like a silly law. It is
well,
silly. Well, it's not a silly law.
I was being polite to the election board personnel.
There's a purpose. There's a reason why that law exists.
There is indeed. And they told me that I would only be able to vote by affidavit. And I said, well, what's the good in filing an affidavit ballot? There's no guarantee that'll be counted. They said, yes, you're absolutely correct. And so Kafka springs to mind at this stage, or should. And I went back to the polling station. I filed an affidavit ballot, and I was livid. So I went back to my office, and I started looking into what was going on, and I found that the provision that creates those closed primaries was Election Law Section 5-304, which says that you need to change your party registration in order to be able to vote in a party primary in New York 6 months and 10 days before the primary. Now, 6 months and 10 days before the primary, pretty much nobody would have believed that Donald Trump was going to be on the ballot, and nobody would have believed that Bernie Sanders was going to be on the ballot.
I don't think I'd even heard of Bernie Sanders 6 months before the primaries.
It was it was impossible to predict, which means that the law is on its face null and void, in my not so humble opinion. So I did some research, and I learned that in 1973, the United States Supreme Court, under the federal Constitution, had said that Election Law 5-304, or its predecessor, was constitutional under the federal Constitution. And I was tearing my hair out, just incensed by this. I don't remember the name of the case, but it's reasonably well known. But then I decided to look at what the state constitution said. As you know, and as probably all of your viewers know, but maybe some of them don't, as well as the United States Constitution, every one of the states has their own constitution. And the New York State Constitution, the federal Constitution doesn't say a word about voting rights. Doesn't say a word about the franchise. Nothing. Not a single word in it. Whereas the New York State Constitution is rather robust on the subject, protecting the right to vote, protecting infringements upon the right to vote. And it has, I think, 26 words specifically about the franchise. The franchise being the right to vote. And so I sued in state court under the New York State Constitution to nullify that law and to initially to prevent the votes from being counted. I was very close to the deadline for that, so I never expected to win an injunction on that basis. But, you know, the sort of plain English language constitutional sense of what those words meant in the New York State Constitution was undeniable. And so I sued. And guess what? I lost.
Oh, the irony of it all. Right after we were just talking about voting rights, we had the PSC talking about asking for volunteers for an upcoming election. You couldn't have timed it better. It was completely accidental. It's just
it reminded me of something that happened to me many years ago. It's totally unrelated, but I don't think I've ever told you this story, and I think you'll find it funny.
All right.
Try
me.
I snapped my Achilles tendon playing squash when I was 42, which is 11 years ago. And apparently it's kind of common when males over the age of 40 snap the tendon for them to get a blood clot in the leg.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I went to the orthopedic surgeon, and he indeed detected a blood clot and put me on a blood thinner called Xarelto. Well, without making the story too long, basically, about 2 months later, I ended up with a nosebleed, which I'd never had a nosebleed, so I didn't associate it with the fact that I was on a blood thinner, and that may sound dumb, but it's true.
It's the kind of thing that you don't often think about.
And anyway, suffice it to say that my nose bled for 3 weeks.
Straight?
Yeah. I was in the hands of I think probably one of the best otolaryngologists in the country. And he tried, cauterization with silver nitrate and cauterization with whatever else. He was doing everything he could possibly do to avoid surgery, which I appreciate. And I ended up having surgery, and I woke up at about 5:30 the following morning in the hospital, and the first ad was a lawyer's ad for people suing because they had taken Xarelto. and then I fell asleep again. And half an hour later, I woke up and there was an ad for Xarelto on the TV.
You know what? You can't make this stuff up. Like, if you're writing a comedy sketch for something or writing, lines for a comedian for his next act, he couldn't come up with this stuff. So, you don't need to invent stuff. You can just look around the world and find it. It's always there.
Fact is much more interesting than fiction.
Absolutely. So the end result of your legal battle with the state of New York about your voting, lack of ability to vote in the primaries, the end result was?
Well, so the judge was Arthur Engeron, who's also now presiding over something to do with one of the...
Was that?
852 million Trump lawsuits.
Was that the court appearance where we were?
Yes.
There?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he had a particularly childish...
He was an arrogant prick, I thought.
I didn't know him well enough to say that.
He came off as... I would say he was slightly less arrogant than Barney Frank, the head of the Rules Committee of the Democratic Party.
Well, I often find that arrogance and intellectually challenged go together. Anyway, he ruled against me. And there is also a provision in the New York State Constitution that says that when you are... when you sue on a constitutional principle, you can avoid going to the intermediate appellate court and go straight to the Court of Appeals. In New York, the Court of Appeals is the highest court in the land. And as a general matter in litigation, you start in a trial court, you go to an appellate court, and then you go to a Supreme Court. Most states, they call their highest court the Supreme Court, but in New York, we call it the Court of Appeals. And there's a provision in the Constitution that just plainly says you can go straight to the Court of Appeals. So I tried to do that, and the Court of Appeals said no, because while this is a matter of while this is a constitutional matter, it's, according to them, not constitutionally significant. So the Court of Appeals, in that instance, and with some jurisprudence before it, jurisprudence just meaning case law, they had already watered down that provision of the Constitution, so it was meaningless unless they decided they wanted to listen to what the people had to say. And so they turned me down, and then I went to the Appellate Division, First Department. New York has 4 appellate courts: the Appellate First, Second, Third, and Fourth Departments. The First Department sits in Manhattan. And their basic question to me was, why should we do anything? The Court of Appeals has already told you you're wrong. To which I said that the Court of Appeals hadn't thought about it enough, and they hadn't either, and they ought to. They ruled against me.
Funny that.
Weird.
Who would have thought?
Weird. I don't know, maybe Democratic and Republican Party functionaries? I don't know.
Well, you know, my side of that story, because I was involved with the open primaries. And, you know, the one thing I should say to people listening is that these rules still exist. Nothing's changed. Oh,
and let me add one more thing. While there are many states in the country that have open primaries, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head now. There are still... I think
there's like 20-something.
26, 28, something like that have open primaries. Many still have closed. But New York, this bastion of democratic freedom, has the single worst restriction on this question in the country. 6 months and 10 days is longer than anywhere else.
Yeah, and it's the second most populous state in the country, of course.
Yeah, so, and arguably the most powerful state in the country.
Possibly, yeah. Well, on a certain level, yeah. Yeah, influence-wise, definitely. But, yeah, I mean, my story is that, you know, I was involved with open primaries, and we were trying to gather as many names on a petition to change that law and present that to the Democratic National Committee, the Rules Committee, at the Democratic National Convention, and that would have been in summer of 2016. And I think we had gathered 42,000 signatures. Probably your name was on there, I'm sure. And myself and a guy named Al Benninghoff, who was involved, went down to the convention. You know, we were initially locked out of the Rules Committee meeting. We weren't even allowed to get in. So we stood in the hallway and started, myself and Al and about 30 other people just started hollering and screaming and yelling and banging on the door in the middle of this meeting. And eventually they had to open the door and let us in. So they did. But they kind of segregated the Bernie people onto one area and all the, quote, Hillary people into another area. And you know, the Rules Committee consists of 7 cronies, you know, of the Democratic establishment. And I'm not picking on the Democratic Party. There's cronies in the Republican Party too.
Although
dinosaur-like kind of creatures.
Although the superdelegates do really make the Democratic Party worse than the Republican Party, I think.
Well, that's a whole other story altogether.
Fair enough. Let's not go there.
We can talk about that later.
No, let's not. It sounds boring.
But so, you know, we got in there, and I don't know if he's still head of the committee, but at that time, Barney Frank was holding the gavel, and you know, we waited and waited and waited for hours and hours and hours while case after case after case was presented to the committee, and some of them were discussed, and some of them were rejected out of hand. And eventually, I think they were going to try and they didn't even bother to announce us. And one of us, a woman, got up and said, "Hey, what about us? Like, we've been waiting for 7 hours out here, and we have this very important thing to discuss." So Barney Frank kind of begrudgingly let her come up to the microphone and speak. And 2/3 of the way through what she was saying, he kind of banged the gavel and said, looked at his other cronies and said, "Well, haven't we already talked about this? You know, we've got other things to talk about." Bang, and that's it. So right there, thousands and thousands of hours of hard work, passionate labor to do something that we considered to be the right thing was just tossed out on a whim, just like that. And then, you know, unfortunately, I had to be witness to an aspect of the convention, which I'll never forget, which was, you know, how all the Bernie candidates kind of folded, and Bernie kind of kissed the ring and kneeled down on his, you know, and we realized, oops.
He was my second big disappointment in political life.
Well, that's how I felt too. I was very deeply, as many people were, deeply disappointed.
Can I just say one thing? It wasn't just thousands of hours, valuable as they were, that were snuffed out in that Barney Frank gavel. It was also millions of votes.
Yes, absolutely. And so the conclusion being, and perhaps you'd like to expand upon this notion that essentially the two parties are private establishments. They're not, you know, they're not public establishments. They're private clubs running on public money. Yet they make up the rules, and they create these very restrictive, you know, like ability to get onto the debates, for example. You know, the fact of how many votes you have to raise just to get on the ballot. We're going to have Diane Sare on the show about 9:30. You know, she knows all about that. I mean, she actually managed miraculously as a you know, non-Democrat or not Republican candidate to get on the ballot. But that's almost like a Herculean feat.
Yeah, it starts with, for me at least, it started with my utter astonishment when I learnt, I don't know how long it was ago, but it was certainly after the Bernie lawsuit, that the Commission on Presidential Debates, or whatever that fancy-sounding organization is, that decides who's going to get on that debate stage and who's going to get the airtime on the oligopolistic media and how they get on there. That commission is a private corporation owned, I think, 50-50 by the Democratic and Republican parties. It might be 51-49 or something.
But it used to be run by the League of Women Voters, but they got
booted out.
They got well, they may have opted out or something like that, but they
or bought out, perhaps.
Bought out, or who knows what. But yeah, that was.
But then, you know, I'm looking forward to talking to Diane again. But her situation was remarkable. It used to be that New York had this draconian law that required gathering 15,000 signatures within a specified period of time.
15 or 50?
15,000 it used to be, which is very restrictive in the first instance. But, But I'm getting there. And Andrew Cuomo changed the law without anybody really noticing, you know, because that's what you do in a democracy. You change the law without people really noticing. He tripled that number and made it 45,000 in order to get on. And with Herculean effort, Diane got 65,000 signatures within the time period, so as nobody could challenge her in court. Then instead they got it the other way around, but this time she's not running for president. She was running for Senate against Chuck Shumer. And there was a senatorial debate that was hosted by multinational giant Spectrum. and Spectrum just banned her from the debate stage. So they had Chuck Schumer and the feckless because he's in New York, Republican candidate. I can't remember his name, don't know anything about it. So if you're listening to this feckless Republican candidate, don't take it personally, but you're feckless within this system. And they did their debate, and Diane held her own sort of rally debate at the same time, which of course nobody knows about because it wasn't covered anywhere other than in the only media, independent media. Which
is kind of an interesting segue into the next subject that I would like to discuss. We started out the show talking about free speech, so we should get into that. But before we do that, we'll take another couple of breaks. This one's called Community Fridges. I don't know if there's any irony on that one. So
we'll figure it out after.
We'll think about it when we hear what it is. You're listening to Radio Kingston, WKNY, The Long Way Round, with me, your host, Malcolm Byrne, and my special guest and dear friend, Mark Moody. Mark, before we get into the next big subject, I thought perhaps we could play some music from your playlist, which you've kindly provided. And I was going to play this track by Glass Animals called Take a Slice. Could you preface the song before we play it, or?
I'm not so well educated on music. I can preface it in the way.
Why do you like it?
Yeah, I like it because for two reasons. One is I have it was recommended to me by this utterly wonderful 21-year-old transgender friend of mine who is brilliant and a terrific graphic artist, and who I pleasurably describe as young man. And there's a line in the song. I like the progression of the music. The progress is kind of surprising to me, at least. And there's a line in the song which I'm going to butcher because I haven't listened to the song in a little while ago. I first came across it about 6 months ago, but it's something about I'm gonna daydream because you live in my nightmare or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's just a terrific line.
All right. Well, this is Glass Animals with Take a Slice.
Smells good up here. Yeah, it's the candle, it's sausage. Sausage candle. Most people don't do it the way I do. Very personal. So like you give them the money in 20s, like whatever. I just like sausage.
Glass. Animals take a slice.
I told you I'd butcher it. It's I'm going to sleep because you live in my daydreams.
Okay. That's actually a better line even.
I think so.
It's a little more optimistic as well. That's a great track. I've never
glad you like it.
Never heard that group before or that song. So
me neither.
It's always, for me, one of the things I love the most about doing this show is it's constantly forcing me to find, because I'm one of those weird boomer. I guess I don't know. I suppose I am 1960, but I don't like listening to the same old crap. Like I'm not interested in hearing, the Doobie Brothers or Led Zeppelin or whatever, like over and over and over for the millionth classic rock time. I want to hear something new and different. So
the first,
not that I mind that music. I mean, it's great music, but I've heard it. I want to hear something different. So
do you listen? There seems to be a lot of public distribution of new, cool, unknown music coming out of Kingston. I mean, that intergalactic boogie that's on this radio station.
Oh yeah, on Friday nights. Yeah.
I came across like a week or two ago. She's utterly brilliant.
Yeah, that's one of the newer shows. I love that program.
And then there's a radio station. Anyway, I probably shouldn't say that. Oops.
It doesn't matter. WKZ.
Yeah, that one.
It's not direct competition. It's different.
It's collaborative, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, we're all trying to do the same thing, create a better living environment for all and sundry in this beautiful part of the world.
But they're brilliant too, WKZE. I didn't, if you'd asked me if I like country and western music before listening to that radio a week ago, I would have said nope. But now I do.
I like both kinds of music, country and western. As we say, up in Canada. Up in Canada. What kind of music do you like, country and western? Because, people think, they think of Canada, they think of, hopefully they don't think of Pierre Trudeau or Justin Trudeau too much, but, they think of, when musically they think of Rush, and they think of Gordon Lightfoot and Leonard Cohen, and Tragically Hip if you're a little younger. But when you get outside of the sort of 50-mile perimeter of, like, say, any urban center like Toronto or Montreal, it's pure country. I mean, it's as country as it gets. Where I grew up, that's what they listen to. And so.
Do they have their own style of country? Is it different from American country?
Oh, no, they listen to the, whatever whatever's going right now. And, I can't think of 3 new country acts right off the top of my head because I don't really listen to that kind of music, but,
yeah,
same stuff.
Are there well-known Canadian country bands?
Well, yes, of course, there are some very well-known country artists. I mean, historically, we've had Hank Snow. Oh, yeah,
so well-known, I've heard of him.
Hank Snow and Shania Twain, I suppose she's kind of country. And a few others. But, for the most part, it's a very rural environment. So country kind of, the pickup truck and the big sky and all the rest of it sort of suits. I don't know what it is. Anyway, we're way off topic. Let's talk about, let's delve into the realm of free speech. And then maybe we'll segue into common sense as defined by Thomas Paine. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about your thoughts and feelings and concerns, if we may use that word, about how free speech is being kind of limited every day.
Kind of. Well, I think first of all,
and in what guise it's being censored,
Yeah, I think first of all, you sort of have to understand what free speech is, and I don't think at least I've never found anybody that could really explain to me what it was in words. I had what I thought was a good intellectual understanding of what it meant to live in a free society, and it really wasn't until, I think probably COVID, that I realized that I didn't actually live in a free society. And it wasn't until then that I emotionally understood what that meant. And free speech rolls into that, which is to say that one specific example, we could name hundreds that hundreds of topics that are now difficult to talk about, even with very dear friends. But I did not get vaccinated, which turns out to have been the smart thing for somebody my age. And, you know, I have a lot of older friends. Older people are fantastic because they're much wiser than me. And I found myself in a position where, you know, my stomach was in knots about whether I told them that I hadn't been vaccinated or not, because they were just so terrified of COVID. And because I think it's pretty much always best to err on the side of truth, I did tell them, but I was even scared telling them, because how would that make them think of me? Would they think that, you know, I was some lunatic rebel who didn't care about his own life or something?
Well, more to the point, you're someone who clearly doesn't care about other people.
Yes, and actually wanted them, the older friends in my life, to die. Apparently, they're not my grandparents, but they're the equivalent of. And I erred on the side of truth, but I felt what free speech is emotionally. And I saw an interesting movie not so long ago called Chile 76, which is about life in, it doesn't mention the name Pinochet anywhere, but it's about life in Chile in 1976, so under Pinochet, after Allende had been assassinated. And it was a nice depiction of what it is to live in a society where you have to watch what you say. And at the moment, much as it deeply pains me to say it, the United States is a place where you have to watch what you say. And some of those instances are more significant than others. And interestingly enough, I often find it much easier to talk to total strangers about really complicated issues because they know nothing about what I think.
Well, one of the things that I would add to that conversation is we don't seem to be living in a time where nuance is acceptable.
100%. 100%. And I think, and I really think that we need to find some way of educating people about what free speech means. It's not a slogan. It's free thought. You know, it's the ability to let your mind go where it wants to go. I know as
for better or worse.
For better or worse, but usually for better, because most of us are pretty good. You know, there are some bad apples around. They're mostly in power, but you know, the rest of us are pretty good. And the reason we're not in power is because we're not that dedicated to power.
We're not sociopathic, whatever's.
Exactly. And I have a lot of friends and family members who are, you know, between the ages of 18 and 25, very well educated, very, very bright young people. Very.
I've met some of your family or your cousins.
You have met some of them, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, your nephew, I suppose.
No, it's my oldest goddaughter and her parents and her siblings.
Right. Well, they were very, very intelligent.
Oh, yeah.
We had some very good conversations.
Oh, yeah. Remarkable family. Truly remarkable family. And I don't think that those young people understand what free speech is in the same way as I didn't understand what free speech was when I was a kid. Still am a kid compared to many of my friends, of course. But, you know, we have to... We have to find a way of explaining that shutting down somebody else's capacity to speak is the same as shutting down their capacity to think, and that, you know, the two are inextricably and intimately linked, entwined, and forever will be. And if you're just not allowed to think, whatever the particular prohibition of the day is, or the hour at this stage, you know, how can you ever figure out what truth is?
Well, look, you know, you're a lawyer. You know, words are your stock and trade. Ideas and words are your stock and trade, and deciphering the meanings of words is very much part of, you know, what a lawyer is trained to do. And you know as well as I do, like, let's just, you know, use an example. If you're hired by a client who maybe you know that this person has committed the crime, but you're hired to defend them, you have to go into the courtroom to argue the case for this individual, and you may be taking a position you don't even agree with, but isn't that the root of discovery, is to pick things apart and sometimes take, you know, a what's the word? You know, an alternate view, even just for the sake of debate. But nowadays it feels like you can't even do that. Like I found I couldn't have a conversation about COVID with certain people. And I got vaccinated. I'm not sure that I'm glad I did or not, but the reality is I did, under a certain amount of pressure. But I also was very skeptical. But I found that there were certain people we couldn't even have the conversation. And I remember saying to people like, look, my father was involved in science, and I was taught about what's called the scientific method. You take a hypothesis and you test it, and you run it against facts, and you pull it apart, and to find out whether it's going to hold up. And the same thing goes with discovering what we may call in the court of law the truth of a situation. How can you do that when you're not even allowed to have the conversation, because you're not allowed to talk? Oh, you're not supposed to talk about that subject. I'm going to shut that down.
You know, an interesting relationship that I don't think I'd ever seen before occurred to me while you were talking. FDR, of course, famously said, and I think in the single most important political statement ever made, bar none, said, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." And fear is an absolute killer of free speech.
Well, there's a lot of fear around these days.
Fear of everything.
Perpetuated by the internet.
Yeah.
And the media.
Yeah.
Of course.
And I think maybe part of the project of explaining to our children, and I don't mean that in the Joe Biden sense, I really don't. I don't have any children of my own, but I have lots of young kids that I, would treat like my own around me. Maybe part of teaching what free speech is showing the freedom that's possible once fear is taken away.
Well, something that someone said recently, I can't remember who it was I was listening to or reading, but their point was, when you take away the ability to have certain conversations, whether it be censoring YouTube channels or bloggers or anything like that, because look, we have the state control. I call it state-controlled media, right? Like like the Fox Newses and the NBCs and the CBSs and the MSNBCs and the New York Times specifically, Washington Post, to me they're just mouthpieces for the CIA for the most part.
Stenographers for power.
Exactly. So the only other alternative is independent media. Now we're seeing this big, gradual, huge shutdowns of independent media. But what you're doing is you're underestimating the ability of, you're not giving people the time of day that they might be intelligent enough. Somehow they're saying, oh, you average people are not smart enough to decipher nonsense from truth. We're not going to let you even have that opportunity to decide for yourself.
I don't think they care whether the in inverted commas average. I prefer to call the average American the decent American. But I don't think they care whether the decent American is smart or not. All they care about is that they're better than us.
You don't think there's an effort to sort of dumb us down by not giving people proper educations and denying them access to information?
I do, but I think that's because they think they're better than us.
Well, I guess that goes without saying when your people in power are, as I said previously, mostly a bunch of sociopaths.
And psychopaths. Yeah.
Just need to run this quick thing. It's a station ID it's called a legal disclaimer. In other words, everything that we're saying on this radio station, the radio station is not responsible for it, which is fair enough.
The opinions expressed on this program are those of the speaker or guest and do not necessarily reflect those of the management or staff of Radio Kingston WKNY, AM 1490, FM 1079, Kingston, New York.
Things keep clunking and banging around in this place. I think we've got a ghost. That was a piece performed by Andres Segovia and Joaquin Rodrigo called Fantasia para un something or other.
Great. Do I get to correct you on this?
Yes, you must.
Yay. First time ever and last time I'll ever get to correct you on musical things. I'm very excited. It was written by Joaquin Rodrigo for Andres Segovia, who is, by some people's reckoning, the greatest sort of classical guitarist ever, for his birthday. And it is called Fantasia para una gentilhombre, however you say that in Spanish.
Gentilhombre.
And
Gentilhombre.
it's such a tremendous testament, I think, to friendship, where a man sits down and writes this, I can't remember how long it is, 12 or 15 minute long piece to celebrate this friend of his who he considers a genius.
And then he says, now you go play it.
Yeah.
You can play it for me. It's really hard. But you can hang it. You can do it, Andre. I've seen you do it. Yeah, I just kind of threw that in there because I figured it would liven things up a bit. But from the issue of free speech, I'd like to segue into the concept of common sense.
Can I just say one more thing about free speech?
Absolutely.
There's a reason it's in the First Amendment. Because it's the most important right. Trying to take free speech away is like, it's trying to take blood. It's just intellectual blood, that's all. But
when it's done these days, it's done out of, well, you've used the word fear numerous times, but it's meant, when I see, people on YouTube or whatever being censored, it's under the guise that we're being protected, like from harmful speech.
I had parents. I don't need the government to protect me.
Well, yeah.
Enough said.
Enough said on that one. There's a lot of things that were said and written 50 years or 100 years ago that thankfully they were written and said, because if these people had been around 100 years ago, forget it.
It's happening already. I wasn't sure whether I was going to mention this, but I watched this absolutely, I think, I'd love to get Scott Ritter's opinion on this, this absolutely atrocious film last night, which, unlike most films on Amazon Prime now, is free. And it's called The Covenant by Guy Ritchie.
I heard, you know what? I saw that and I decided without even seeing it, first of all, I don't ever want to see Jake Gyllenhaal dressed up like an army man ever again. But second of all, I'm like, that just looks like bullshit to me. Pardon the expression.
It is... I mean, I don't know if you have seen Snatch or Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels by Guy Ritchie, which
those are good films.
Brilliant movies in my view. This is an utterly disgusting piece of propagandaic nonsense that is whitewashing not only how we got out of Afghanistan, but also what Afghanistan was all about. It's sick.
Well, Hollywood really is an extension of the State Department's propaganda machine at this point, especially when it comes to wars. And I've had this conversation with numerous people. I'm thinking specifically of Chris Hedges, and Scott Ritter actually. Both those individuals have experienced war firsthand. And they've both expressed the fact that there's no such thing as a film that can really portray war because it's difficult to... In fact, Chris had just interviewed a guy named, I think his name's Mark Rawlings, a Vietnam veteran who'd just gone back to Vietnam for the first time in 53 years. And he said he's a poet now, and he said in the interview, like, a film can never portray the experience. It's just too intense. And it's, there's things like the smells and the intensity of it that a film, you're always going to be a voyeur. And therefore it's, in Chris Hedges' words, war pornography. And I thoroughly agree with that. I can't think of a war film besides perhaps a film called Come and See by Elmer Klimev. He's a Russian film director.
I was about to say, I think there are some Russian films that are good about war. I haven't seen any of them.
Well, Come and See is one of the
good, but
Come and See is a reasonable representation. But anyway, back to your point. Yeah, there's a lot of propaganda out there that's just pushing people's brains into the wrong places.
One more thing on that point. Are you familiar with? I'm sure you are. A man named Vijay Prashad.
Of course.
He said something to segue to where you want to go to that I think is commonsensical. He said, I don't know, I don't understand why people call them war crimes. War is a crime.
Right. Well, and what's very disappointing, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, is that there are people whom I've considered very close friends, but over the past year, debate in terms of like being an anti-war activist, and has been literally, I've been told, I will not debate this subject. This situation is different. We don't even get to have this conversation. And these are people who would have been thoroughly against, they would have been in the streets marching in 2003 to stop the U.S. invasion, illegal occupation of Iraq. But now somehow apparently it's okay to be pro-war because now these wars are different.
Well, lots of...
And I'm not going to mention which wars, where they're happening, or anything like that, but...
On one of the more significant wars going on at the moment, those sociopathic manipulators that call themselves our leaders have been convincing us for 25 years that the greatest threat to humanity is a man named Vladimir Putin. So when the greatest threat to humanity starts a war, how are ill-educated people supposed to respond to that?
But wasn't the greatest threat to humanity named Muammar Gaddafi about 10 years ago? And before that, his name was Saddam Hussein. And before that, it was, it's always been the case. I mean, I'm not going to get into a big debate about whether, the Second World War was justified, but there's a lot of nonsense even about that conflict.
Yeah, it's always this one man. Everything's tied up in one man. Forget the millions of people that one man or one woman sometimes represents. Forget the differences in culture. Forget the differences in language. Forget all the things that you don't know. Oh, you know the name Gaddafi or Hussein or Putin or whoever, or Chavez or Maduro or Xi Jinping or whoever it happens to be. And it filters down into domestic politics because you know that depending on your political persuasion, you know that Trump's evil. And you also know, depending on your political persuasion, you know that Biden's evil. But you forget that there are millions of people supporting both of those candidates, and yet the millions of people and the different cultures that they come from across this magnificent land of ours get forgotten in the name Biden or in the name Trump. What's wrong with us?
Well, I'll tell you what, when you figure that out, you let me know. I'm dying to know.
I think we're just honestly, I think we're just a little bit too scared. We need a little bit of courage, a little bit of humility, a little bit of courage. Go a long way.
Well, let's play another track, and then we'll spend the last 10 or 12 minutes before hopefully Diane Sare joins us to talk about Thomas Paine and common sense. So the next track on the playlist is Portage and Bess. And I've chosen the Billie Holiday and the Billie Holiday Orchestra rendition because that's my favorite.
Wonderful.
So do you want to tell me why this song is on your list, or you just love it and that's all there is to it?
I can't tell you. I just love the whole the whole thing. I just love it. I can't articulate why I like it.
Portage and Bess. Summertime and the living is easy. Yes, indeed. Mark, Common Sense, Thomas Paine, fill us in. I think it's a very important aspect, overlooked aspect of our history in America.
I'm really sort of astonished. Over the past several years, I've talked to a lot of people about Thomas Paine and Common Sense, and you can ask an American who Betsy Ross was, and everybody will tell you, she knitted the first American flag. But ask who Thomas Paine was, and very few people have ever heard of him. And in my opinion, Thomas Paine, and this will come as a shock to many listeners perhaps, but I think that history bears me out. Thomas Paine is the father of America. He wrote a pamphlet which was generally recognized to be 46 pages long. Some say 47 pages. And it was published. Well, he was brought over to America by Ben Franklin. He was an English dude. I won't go into his profession or anything like that. But he was one of the very first abolitionists. He was fiercely anti-slavery a long time before he even came to America, and he wrote this 46-page tract called Common Sense, which argued persuasively and vehemently for America to take up arms against the tyrant of King George and King George's Parliament. It was published on January 9th, 1776. It is, to my knowledge, how do you say that? It's the best-selling book in American history per capita.
More than the Bible?
Per capita, yeah. Meaning that the number of Americans alive at the time who read Common Sense or bought Common Sense was greater than anything else.
Okay.
And maybe
not to be overshadowed by 50 Shades of Grey.
maybe I should qualify that by saying it, because the Bible's a good question. Maybe it's the best-selling American book in American history. And, he argued... Well,
the Gideons don't sell the Bible. It's just free.
He argued forcefully and persuasively that this is what should happen. And, of course, the day that we all know is July 4th, 1776, when we declared our independence based on the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote in 13 days with very little edits by anybody else. But it seems to me that there's no possible way that Thomas Jefferson could have written the Declaration of Independence without Common Sense having been published. So the guiding ethos in America is found in Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution that came 13 years later is an incredible piece of legal architecture, but it doesn't capture Common Sense or the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't capture the kind of human freedom that those documents dreamt of. It doesn't come close.
And what did they, in a nutshell, essentially claim? Philosophically, the idea of common sense. Why is that title important?
I don't think the title is particularly important, other than that Thomas Paine chose that title. But I think it's particularly important today. I think we need to reinvigorate common sense. This might mean something different from what Thomas Paine thought. To Thomas Paine, it was just common sense. You want to be free, you got to throw off the yoke of the British Crown. That's it. And I think that today, common sense sort of requires, and common sense is surprising in the depth it goes into sort of, how many ships America could build and that sort of thing. I mean, he goes into some granular economic detail. But I think what he was demanding was critical thought. Just the capacity to think for yourself, the capacity to receive information and wonder whether it was true or not. And he knew that what he was writing was the truth. And I think maybe he could, I don't have any historical evidence for this, but maybe he thought just telling the truth was common sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good definition for me, as long as your truth is driven by at least a little bit of critical thought and skepticism.
Well, those are the words that I'm more interested in these days is, like, for example, this recent occurrence in Canada, in the Parliament, where Justin Trudeau and the entire Parliament stood up, welcomed Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, gave him, 20-odd standing ovations, and then gave a couple of standing ovations to this fellow named Yaroslav Hunka. And when the Speaker of the House was introducing this individual and had said, here's a man who fought the Russians in World War II. Well, what aspect of common sense and skepticism is missing from all of those people in that crowd listening when you say someone was fighting against the Russians in World War II? What part of your brain doesn't say, well, wait a sec, the Russians were our allies. We were fighting the Germans, the Nazis, and so were the Russians. So where's your common sense now?
I think common sense and truth are absolutely devoid from the power structures. Common sense and truth are not their friends. And, what happened in Canada was utterly, with Yaroslav Hunka in particular. But to watch that video, I don't know if, I can't remember who it was. Was it the Grey Zone, perhaps, or Richard Medhurst or somebody?
One of those radical Putin
or
people.
maybe it was Pastor Jardula. I don't remember. Anyway, they insisted on playing the video of the applause over and over and over again. Well, not over and over, but a couple of times.
That was the Grey Zone.
That was the Grey Zone. And you sit there and you see the utter glee in these people. They're just so happy. This is, their common sense is very different from ours. Their common sense celebrates a man like Yaroslav Hunka. What's his name? Hunka. And their common sense celebrates a seemingly repressive monster like Justin Trudeau, and their common sense celebrates a Jewish Nazi like Volodymyr Zelensky. Their common sense celebrates that because they see a world in which they're superior to other people.
And without further ado, Diane Sare is here in the house with us to join us. Hi, Diane. How are you doing?
Hi, pretty well.
So it was a pleasure to hear you both, Mark, and Mark was your guest on your symposium on Friday night. That was a very enjoyable conversation. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
Thanks again for having me on, Diane. It's nice to see you.
Yes, you too.
So what's new, Diane, since we last saw you 2 days ago?
Well, what's new is this horrific situation in Southwest Asia, which is, I find, really disturbing. And I think, one idea I have is that Ukraine is absolutely losing the war, so they want to create another explosion somewhere else. And this one's great because they can have so much completely gut-wrenching coverage that everyone can get into rip-roaring emotional states and lose all reason in the process. And it is just a horror. But I think you get into trouble if you think you're going to address it on the ground, since Netanyahu has been willing to serve as a hand grenade for certain colonial interests, and whoever decided to launch the initial strike, the Hamas strike, could not have not known that Israel would launch the kind of response that they've launched. So I think it's all very suspicious and horrible. And the people who would be interested in this have already demonstrated they don't give a damn about using human beings as cannon fodder for their agenda, as we see in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, these things are always about people and, the humanitarian tragedy of any of these things where, corporations and arms dealers are once again, making a lot of money off of human suffering. So, it's one thing to another, and, we just seem to go from one disaster, and you have to sort of ask yourself how much of this is created, as opposed to, is this really about what we're told? And I'm not just referring to this one specific instance. So
No.
Go back to World War I,
Most of it is created because the people who created aren't the ones on the ground getting slaughtered, right? So they're perfectly happy to expend other people's lives for a geopolitical agenda. And I think also, don't forget, there's a new paradigm emerging very rapidly, much quicker than many people, including those involved in it, expected, with the BRICS expansion, and the Eurasian Economic Union, the new kind of collaboration between nations of the so-called global South, with China and Russia. In a sense, if the U.S. doesn't blow up the world, then we might become irrelevant.
Well, I was having a discussion earlier in the day about this very subject, and Mark, whenever you feel the urge to chime in, please do, because I know you've got thoughts. I can see them in your bouncing around in your cranial
I'm always
capacity.
so transparent.
But
I think Diane's wrestling with her dog again.
Are you wrestling with your dog there? Is that what that is?
Yeah, he gets crazy at this time of day. So I'm just...
Dogs are wonderfully unpredictable creatures. They do what they want. Not quite as much as cats, but certainly. They're like, I'm on the radio. Can you please stop being a dog? But what were you going to say, Mark? You were going to say something.
I don't remember what I was going to say, but I think that
hold that thought.
So much of what we thought we knew about so many situations has turned out to be wrong, with the release of classified information subsequently telling the actual history of what went on. And I wonder about that in what just happened with Hamas. I mean, there are a lot of people who are very interested at the demonstration of the weakness of Israeli security, the Iron Dome and all the rest of it is, of course, highly celebrated across the military-industrial world, and their surveillance capabilities and their intelligence capacities are highly celebrated, and yet somehow, that this military attack worked, and there were a number of Israeli generals who were beginning to stand up and say, we're not doing this on behalf of Israel anymore. And I wonder if if there ever will become any credence to the notion that they let this happen in order to get the generals back on board.
Well, I think it's early days, and the problem right now is that emotions are so high on this subject. It's someone that I like to listen to occasionally, I think it was Garland Nixon or perhaps Alex Christoforou, said, said something along the lines of, we're always so quick to rush to judgment, especially the media, about things, whereas a critical thinker would say, well, let's line up the facts. Let's really think about what we're saying here and wait a little bit to make any kind of a pronouncement on that, but the media is always in such a rush to get the headline and
And it doesn't matter where that is, whether it's Bucha or with vaccinations or with whatever it is. There's a line that comes out, and then you must stick with that line. The option for the application of common sense through critical thinking is almost being ripped away from us.
Diane, I wanted to ask you, because economics is really one of your strong points. In terms of what you were just saying a few minutes ago, and in terms of American power, economic and military and influence-wise, as we see it waning, which clearly it is. I mean, I think you'd have to be blind and deaf and dumb to not understand that the so-called American empire has hit the peak and it's now on a downward trajectory. And, like all empires, they never go down without kicking and screaming, and that happened with the British Empire. It happened with the Mesopotamian Empire. I mean, Roman Empire, where do you think the line will be where or do you think there will come a time when the dollar is no longer the international currency, for example?
Well, I think that's fast coming. I mean, frankly, the dollar's been a fraud ever since Nixon decoupled it from the gold reserve system. And it was still backed by a certain amount of productivity, but we don't do that anymore. So we've just gone to print money and it's irrelevant. I don't think the United States has to be irrelevant if we acted like we were supposed to have acted. Our nation wasn't founded to be an empire. Unfortunately, nobody seems to know that anymore, and certainly it's not the principle of our so-called ruling class. But we did have a revolution against the British Empire, and if you read the Declaration of Independence, virtually every single item in there that the British were doing to us, we are now doing to everyone else in the world. So I think it would be worthwhile for Americans to reflect on how that came to occur and what would be the consequences if we were to reverse it, if we were to stop acting like that. Because, I mean, frankly, who wants to be an ally of the United States if we're going to poke their eyes out and cut off your eye? I mean, what kind of friendship is that? Who needs enemies when you have friends like the United States,
well,
right?
What's the famous Henry Kissinger quote? To be America's friend is deadly, and to be its enemy is deadly, and to be its friend is fatal.
Oh God, yeah, and I think he wanted it to be that way. But
I don't say that out of admiration, by the way.
I had Scott Ritter on my symposium the week before. I think Mark and Rich and I were on together. And at one point, I finally asked him, well, what would you do if you were Secretary of State and the United States had a sane president? So he said, okay, well, let's say that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. were president and I were Secretary of State. I would fly to North Korea immediately. I would tell them we're lifting the sanctions unconditionally. We would prefer that you renounce your nuclear weapons, but there's not going to be force behind it in the same way as South Africa. This war against Russia and China is over. And he said, then I would fly to Taiwan. And of course, the Chinese wouldn't like that, but I would tell the Taiwanese that the American policy is the one China policy, and you're going to have to figure out how to resolve things with China. And I would fly to China and tell them that we have a one China policy. And then I'd fly to Brussels and tell them that we're not having a war. We're not backing Ukraine anymore, and NATO is going to ultimately disintegrate. Anyway, he went through this it was like a world tour, very exciting, frankly. And he said, now, if the United States did that, we would have real power in the world. Everyone would say the United States is the peacekeeper. We got a problem over here. Okay, America, come in and help us. He said, what makes us irrelevant is that we are the source of the trouble. So everyone wants to get away from us, wants to have nothing to do with us. I find it so ironic to hear Biden talk about how we've succeeded in isolating Russia. No, we've succeeded in becoming a pariah nation, and Russia has friends with dozens of nations around the world, as is China, our other, big alleged competitor. And by the way, I just want to say something that I found very interesting. A young group of my associates, but the younger ones from the Schiller Institute, just returned from China. They went there for 2 weeks. And because of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's work and that they were invited by the Chinese Youth Federation, they had very high-level meetings, including with the person, I think, responsible for American policy in their foreign ministry. I mean, they had really high-level discussions. And what a number of people said to them is they said, we really wish you would stop talking about competition. We don't want to be a competitor. If you're a competitor, it means someone has to win. And that means someone has to cheat. Someone has to break the rules. We would much prefer collaboration. And I found that interesting because, Americans are very competitive. We tend to think competition doesn't have to be hostile, that it can be a good thing, right? You talk about small businesses and the competition, but I think you have to bear in mind that you're dealing in China with a history, and especially now with Xi Jinping, who really is sort of a Confucian scholar, you're dealing with an entirely different approach that is not the way we often would think about things. Although I think there's a reason why Ben Franklin studied Confucius so much and actually published the Analects of Confucius in his newspaper in Philadelphia. So we look at things that the Chinese are doing and we say, well, there must be some ulterior motive. I mean, someone really wouldn't do that just for the good of it. I mean, they probably are trying to put one over on us. And I'm not to say everything that every Chinese businessman does or something is legitimate. They have a lot of problems with corruption. We have a lot of problems with corruption. But I do think that becoming aware of and actually enjoying some of the cultural differences and thinking about the richness that adds to the world and also how that can give us insights into our own perspective on things is extremely useful.
I heard something really interesting said about China a couple of years ago. And the guy said China is the first entity ever to become a global superpower without firing a single shot, which I think deserves commendation rather than being chastised for it. They've also lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years and put 300 million of those people in the middle class.
Yes, but what about Xinjiang? What about the Uyghurs?
Oh, the poor Uyghurs.
I mean, that's the usual trope, right?
Right. Yeah, no, it's so, and it contributes to American cynicism and pessimism, doesn't it? Because Americans say, well, there can't really be just someone who's interested in good. How can you have that? And I have to tell you, they talked about, they went to visit a village that had been completely impoverished just 6 years ago, a village of 300 people. And the way they had gotten rid of the poverty there is a group of university students had been assigned to go to the village and figure out how they were going to get them out of poverty. So the university students went to this place, and my friend said that it was clear by the missing teeth and of the older generation that it had been really poor. So they went there and discovered that people had rounds of starvation and so on, and that the only thing they had to eat were chestnuts. So this little village had figured out 1 million exotic ways of preparing chestnuts, including making them taste like pork, including all kinds of things. Wow. So they said, well, this is really interesting. If we could hook you up to the internet, you could market your chestnuts And that's exactly what they did. And so this little place with 300 people became famous for their chestnuts.
Oh, that's
It
cool.
opened up a massive trade. They're all middle class now people, and you should see the houses. They showed pictures of these. They have these gigantic houses, and one of the young guys, he's 19 years old from Missouri. He said, I grew up in a small town, and when I looked at these giant houses, I said, I would expect a big house like this in the suburb of a major city, not in a town with 300 people. And they're converting rooms into Airbnb. Now, how can you have communism where people are allowed to have all this unregulated Airbnb stuff, but people who live in Beijing want to come out to this little town for the weekend? So they're also making a business doing that. And I just found that completely delightful. And how many axioms of what Americans have been told about China does that shatter?
Everyone.
Well, I mean, we were told, I'm old enough to remember that the reason we were in Vietnam was to win hearts and minds. So if you believe that, you'll believe anything.
Well, maybe in terms of organ trafficking or something.
Yeah, I was going to say, you never realized that winning hearts and minds meant taking the hearts and minds out of the bodies they were previously in. That's what winning them means.
Well, there's a guiding principle, and it's the first article of the International Declaration of Human Rights, as written in 1947, 48. What year was that?
Something like that.
Which
Roger Waters is good on this.
I know he is, and it basically says, I'm paraphrasing, that every human being has the right to a life and to their freedom, as it just based on the fact that they're a human being and that they exist.
I like to proudly point out that it's the Declaration of Independence for the first time in human history said that governments ought to protect the ability of their citizens to pursue life, liberty, or to have life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. I mean, the Declaration of Human Rights is built on our Declaration of Independence, and I think we ought to be bloody proud of that. And in 250 years, nearly 250 years, we've done a pretty good job of living up to that possibility. Our innovation and creativity is pretty astonishing for a 250-year-old country, and I think we can proudly stand against a 5,000-year-old culture and say, I bet they learnt from us pulling 800 million people out of poverty. I bet they said, hey, look, that American idea, that's pretty good.
Well, I mean, it's probably a little-known fact that Ho Chi Minh was a great admirer of the American Constitution and actually was trying to get the United States on side to fight, against originally the Japanese. But, that those factoids seem to be being obscured by history. Diane, we're going to run out of time fairly soon. Is there anything else? Is there something that you'd like to discuss that's that we perhaps ought to? Oh, she's gone chasing after her dog again.
Sorry, he just started barking now, so he's going to interrupt. But yeah, actually, tomorrow it is, I think, going to occur in Philadelphia that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to announce that he's running as an independent candidate. And I think that's earth-shattering. And I think it's the first major name former Democrat to actually go ahead and just say, I'm going to run as an independent. I think it shatters all kinds of things. I think the Democratic National Committee is absolutely hysterical about it. I met some of their people in Westchester County, New York, who were frothing at the mouth that a vote for Robert Kennedy is a vote for Trump. And I said,
well, I was told that about Bernie Sanders, for God's sakes.
Right. And I said, well, I don't know if that would be so bad, which caused their heads to explode even more. And, but, if they were really upset, if they were worried about that, they shouldn't have decided that they were going to steal all of his votes and give them to Joe Biden. And I mean, and that was public, right? And I appreciate that Kennedy made a public videotape where he explained how if he got 60% of the vote in New Hampshire and in Iowa, that his delegates would be given to Joe Biden, and that this would be, in effect, robbing the voters of their vote. And clearly he couldn't get it resolved. He tried mightily, and clearly the DNC is a completely fascist organization, if you had any doubts after Hillary Clinton. So I just think this is huge, fascinating. I don't know how the media is going to handle it. I think it creates a wide open situation in the United States. And I wonder how the process looks to people around the world, where we have the two leading candidates who are opposing Biden, Donald Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., both of whom think the war should be ended, that it didn't need to happen, etc. And one of them, Donald Trump, is facing 91 indictments. And anytime anything happens, they just indict him again. And now they have a gag order on him because they hope that he violates it so they can throw him in jail. And then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., who has armed gunmen showing up at his meetings and can't get Secret Service protection from the incumbent president against whom he's running. Mm-hmm. I mean, if any other country were doing this, of course, we would be storming in there accusing them of not having free and fair elections, but it's the United States.
Yeah, there's a certain irony in that, isn't there?
It's disgraceful. That's all it is.
Well, I just,
un-American is what it is.
There's already been one attempt that we know of on RFK's life, which is probably part of the catalyst for this decision, I should think.
We ought to start. Well, I don't know how to do these sorts of things. What do I know? But I would love to see groups of people starting to say that if a hair on Robert F. Kennedy's head is harmed, then something will happen bad, because we know who will have done it.
Yeah, three guesses in the first two don't count, as we say in Canada. Yeah, I mean, our RFK. He, for me, some of his opinions are fairly controversial, I should think, to many people. Certainly, people that listen to this station regularly would not be entirely on board with his policies. But the fact that there's at least an alternative to these two grumpy old men.
But I also think that at some point...
there is Cornel West, by the way.
At some point, if you don't like somebody's opinion, you have an obligation to go out and read what they've written that provides what they believe is factual support for their position. And if you don't have the time to do that, you have no business deciding that their opinion is wrong.
Well, the trouble is, so many of us get our information from a click and a YouTube clickbait or whatever it is.
The antidote to brainwashing is reading.
Right. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up. Diane, thank you so much for dropping in on the show. It's been an honor and a pleasure, as always.
Thank you for having me.
And your dog.
What's your dog's name, Diane?
His name
Cuddles.
is Baxter, and he's 2 years old.
Baxter?
So, yeah, I'll get rid of this so you can see. He's just completely.
There he
is.
Look at you. Yeah. You suddenly turned into like a 7-year-old girl with him.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna have to stop. I'm gonna have to shut this.
That's why I got him. It's good for ulcers and blood pressure. Stop it.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you, Mark Moody, for being on the show.
Thank you so much,
And to all of you in the audience, if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you next week.
Very nice to see you, Diane.
See you.
Bye, Baxter.
Take care. Good night.